what it sets up is what the research refers to as a disciplinary approach to history. Historians agree that there is no single source of information that will tell you about the past, that you have to look at multiple accounts, and those accounts differ, and that you have to construct your understanding of the past. And one of Sam Weinberg's graduate students, Abby Reisman, went into San Francisco public schools, and she conducted a year-long study. She went into 10 Title I high schools, and she trained half the 11th grade teachers to teach U.S. history in this disciplinary approach. And she looked to measure three things. 1, student content knowledge. 2, student reading level. And 3, student engagement. And what she found out is that students who were taught history in this way retained more content, as measured by what at the time was the California State Exam in U.S. History, no longer exists. 2, their reading levels went up. Now this is Title I schools, majority first and second generation immigrant population, and 11th graders were seeing their reading comprehension scores go up as much as 2 grade levels, which, as we know, reading levels don't change much after about 7th grade. They're pretty much locked in. And so to move 11th graders that dramatically is huge. And then if you look at the videos and you read the research, the engagement and excitement level of her students is up dramatically. Their hands are up in the air, they're talking about the discipline, they're talking about feeling engaged. And what it sets up is what I'd call in the book a history lab. And a history lab first asks you to organize your instruction around a central question that doesn't have one answer. So we're not moving students towards A, B, C, or D, true or false, or this word goes in the blank. Then we put kids in the position where they have to do source work. They have to do the work of history. And to do it, they have to be taught a specific set of literacy skills. And those are the skills that are outlined by Weinberg's work, which is on the front of that stapled packet. And then finally, students have to be able to support an evidence-based answer to that historical question using the evidence. And that is cognitively challenging, but it's also interesting. Because if you do it right, kids love to argue. And if you can get them to argue about your favorite dead people, it's a great day for you, and it's a great day for them. We all know that engagement is about 85 to 90% of our job. An engaged child is so much easier to teach. A disengaged child is that much more difficult. And it's the engagement piece that really drives the history lab. 2 caveats, and then we're going to give you a chance to put some flesh on the bones. 1, a history lab is not a DBQ. How many of you have been through DBQ training or used DBQ materials or teach AP, or at least know what the initials stand for? Okay. DBQ is a document-based question. The document-based question is probably the oldest non-lecture sort of assessment tool that's out there. It began with the College Board. It gives students a number of documents. It used to be 20, then it was 12, now they're down to around 10. And students have to take the documents, organize it into sides, and use the evidence to build an argument. The history lab goes one step further. It requires students first to look at where the document came from, who wrote it, when it was written, and then to rank their documents. And in some instances, disregard documents because we have questions about their validity or their point of view and how it informs their information. And then the students have to make connections between documents. But the history lab is much more challenging, and as we'll talk about at the end, doesn't always end in a 5-paragraph essay. Much of the DBQ process is focused on getting students to write 5-paragraph essays. And ours is to get kids to shoot a little bit higher in terms of historical thinking. Just to remind you, all of these things tie into your Georgia standards. in terms of the information processing skills, interpreting political cartoons, consistency of information, analyzing graphs and diagrams. It's also there in your reading standards, reading primary sources, assessing the extent to which reasoning and evidence and text support the author's claim, and it's also in your writing standards. So there's a direct connection to what you're doing here in Georgia. What I'm going to ask you to do, talk about the most pertinent questions in the room right now. What kind of questions do you have about what was shared? What are your thoughts about the research?
Probably one of the most obvious questions, why aren't we taught, it seems like when we're in college we're taught history as a content, but nothing about methodology, and so how do we change how history is taught in our district? Because we all want this,
Start with the
we all
question.
want these results. We want our kids to be thinking at a higher level. We want to bring in this primary sources, so they are looking at documents and they are having conversation and developing more questions and arguments, that they could have an intelligent question with an intelligent debate.
Yeah, I think maybe for like my honor students, I could let them have a little bit more freedom after you do a history lab for a while. But with CP, I think you definitely have to give them the
I wouldn't feel
sources.
comfortable letting them go out on their own trying to find it. I feel like they would need some direction, especially the first one.
Yeah.
Initially, you need to model as much as you can, probably, on how to do that with CP especially.
Questions that you have about the research, about the process, about the changes that I've made, anything you were bouncing off your colleagues?
One question we were discussing was how when you're compiling your documents for them to use, how do you accommodate for all the different reading levels that you might have in one class? Because we have some that have pretty broad ranges.
Yeah. You have to look for that point where the documents are not too easy for your high flyers. They're not too hard for your kids that really, really struggle. Your goal is to make sure they can get it. So making it too complicated doesn't benefit anyone. You need to make sure that they can access the information and get there. And then two, chunk it and keep it short. Historians will tell you, oh, you really shouldn't edit documents because if you put in ellipses or you shorten it, they're not getting the whole document. And my response is, I can fully understand that. But when was the last time you taught in a K-12 situation? If I have to shorten it to 250 words so the kids can get the essence of it, rather than reading all 15 pages of Henry Clay's American System speech, I can live with that. I will say, though, be careful with ellipses. A lot of times when we put ellipses in documents to shorten them, sometimes we unintentionally change the argument, so you kind of have to be careful. But kids being able to access and read it and make use of the information is the most important part. Sam Weinberg and Abby Reisman talk about that documents should be no more than 250 words. And I make the statement that documents should be no more than what the group in front of you can handle. Because 250 words for some of my 11th graders isn't challenging enough. For some of my 11th graders, it's just right. And if you're doing it with middle school or elementary school, 250 words might actually be too much. And so I always say it's who's in front of you and what they need, which is unsatisfying, but we know that's really where we earn our money, is making those differentiation choices in the classroom. Yes, sir.
How do we incorporate for our ESOL students?
Same way that you do in any other situation. You make that adaptations. It depends upon if you're teaching them in a contained situation or they're integrated into your regular classroom. And there's enough websites where you can take and drop English and it'll translate it into Spanish and then you can print it out in Spanish. I don't see that as disadvantaging everyone, because the point is to get them into the information to learn.
Do you give them the sources, or do they find them themselves, and how many sources do you give if you do give them to them?
I limit my sources to no more than 6. And what I found is that students, After about 6 sources, start to lose the differences between the sources and the differences in the argument. It all kind of gloms together. And so I make the argument 4 to 6 is the range that you want to shoot for. And then I provide them for the students. When I first started, I said, we'll let them go find all their sources. Well, 2 days later, when they've got 25 different sources, 2 of which aren't historical sources, they were written by somebody who lives in his mom's basement, it becomes more problematic. So the way I argue it is, when an historian is researching something and they go to an archive, an archivist doesn't bring them the entire archive. They bring them the sources that they think are most pertinent to what they're investigating. And so you're serving that role of archivist in the classroom as you select. And we'll talk a little bit in the 3rd session about some criteria that you might use when you're picking those documents so that they open up the argument and the debate.